Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Many apologies for my voice. I've been having a little bit of strep throat and cold, maybe flu-like symptoms this week. Fortunately, you can't catch those over the internet. For today's free wire work tutorial, I want to share with you the Goddess Chakra Drop Pendant. I'll show you that a little bit more closely on the board in just a second. It's a very, very long piece, but I quite like dramatic pendants, so I hope that you will too. It only uses 2 gauges of wire and not a vast amount of those. There are some beautiful beads that can work in with this piece as well. So if you'd like to join me down at the board, we'll take a closer look at what it is we're looking to create today. So this is the Goddess Chakra Drop Pendant. So we've got a focal bead down at the bottom, which could be almost anything you want it to be. I'm going to be working with a faceted amethyst here today. And I've got a slightly different amethyst later on as well. So you could focus on using a birthstone if you wanted to. You could just make it your favourite gemstone, or you could simply just have a wire coil at the base. The feature of today's wire work tutorial is this chakra bead section going up on the length of the drop of the pendant and the goddess style weaving around each of those beads. Now I have a selection of chakra type beads just to work with today, as well as a focal bead down at the bottom. Like I say, you could just have a coil of wire at the bottom if you didn't want to work with a gemstone, or you could forego the garnet and use a large garnet as the root gemstone down at the base. Entirely up to you. So I'm just going to pop these over and out of the way for a second so I don't knock them flying every time I pick something up. I'll pop those ones into position up here, and I'll just move the beads off to the side. Hopefully I won't send them flying. So for the first section of the tutorial, we're going to be working with 18 gauge or 1mm raw copper wire, and the main piece is going to be between 10 and 12 inches in length, and this forms the centre. So if you wanted to have an elaborate spiral down at the base of the pendant, you might want to take that up to 12 inches, but I'm going to be working with 10 inches today because I'm just going to pop a small spiral on the bottom and then use a gemstone bead. As always, the first thing that we're going to do is just smooth that wire through to make sure that it's fluid, ready to work for us, and nice and smooth. I've already cut each of those ends with the flush side of my cutters, just to make sure that they are safe and sound to work with. So a nice little smoothing just to get that going. And I'm going to create a very small coil down at the bottom. So using the end of my round nose pliers, I'm going to use small movements to create a coiled section. That's turned into quite an open coil, quite a large coil. You can run that however you want it to be for you. I'm going to go for 2 turns around the centre there. So I've started just here and I've gone around once and then twice. What I'm going to do now is create an angle away from that coiled section. So I've popped in now with my bent chain nose pliers, and I'm just supporting the long tail of wire that's going to come up at 12 o'clock, and I'm just pulling that away from the centre of that coil. You might want to take a hot second there just to make sure that that sits exactly how you want it to, and draw that over. And before I go any further, what I'm going to do is apply just a little bit of strength to the section of wire which will have the chakra beads on it. Now you could hammer with a small block and a delicate touch of a hammer. You could open and close any flat facing pliers, and you'll notice I'm only doing that to the first maybe 2–2.5 inches or so of the wire, just to make sure that I'm not going to overstress the wire that comes up at the top, which we might want to use later for a more elaborate bail. Just trying to keep our options open really. So what I'm going to do now is thread on my base bead. As I said, you could just replace one of the beads from your chakra set with a large bead. If there's a problem with that going on, it's probably because the drill hole is either inadequate in the bead that I've chosen to work with, or there's a little bit of a bend at the end. So we'll try straightening that up and see how we get on. That's actually working just fine now. So I'm going to draw that all the way down so that it sits down at the base. Now the most important place that needs a little bit of extra strengthening is just down here at the bottom. This technique comes from a form of macrame. I understand that stateside that's pronounced macrame, Here in the UK we often say that macrame or macrame. So I'm opening and closing the pliers just on the junction between the coil and the section that comes upright into the pendant. I'm just going to make sure that that's nice and solid. Now there are two ways you can run through this next section. You can either load up all your beads in the correct order and then pop just a little coil over the top to make sure that they don't escape, or you can load your beads on one by one. I'm going to start off by getting the wires into position and then we'll look at loading some more beads on. My second section of wire is quite a long piece. This is 18 inches in length. Again, it is 1mm 18 gauge round. I'm working with raw copper. If you're working with different tempers of wire, you might find this a little bit more hard going, but any wire will work for this design. So again, I'm going to grip hold of the end of that wire and just smooth that between thumb and forefinger just a couple of times to get a little bit of warmth and fluidity. I'm just gripping on at one end with my pliers because I know I have enough wire as an excess for that not to be problematic if I mark the very end. I will probably either cut this section away later, or I will do a little light wrapping around the end for a decorative bail section. The next thing that I need to do is make sure that I find the centre of my longer segment, this is 18 inches, of that 18 gauge or 1mm wire. And what I want to do is to make the central section wrap around the core at the base of my pendant. So it can go underneath if you prefer, or it can go over the top. It doesn't really matter. The technique will be slightly different. But you can do whichever works for you. We're going to work with the longer section of wire underneath. What I want to do is to have that coiling around the central core. So I'm going to pass one side over the other and just push that up and out of the way. Now it will want to become quite loose at this stage. So what we do need to do is make sure that we get a nice tight turn around this section of the wire down at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is just squish that until it closes around. Now that's open, as you can see. So what we want to do is draw those two sides of that wire down together and into position. And with a little bit of manipulation, what we're going to end up with is a nice tight wrap around the central core wire on our drop pendant. So I'm just going to very, very gently squeeze that until it sits neatly how I want it to sit. Now, dependent on which way you have got those wires wrapped, that's going to define which of our wires we work with first. So if you take a closer look just here, you can see that the wire that's coming away on the right is underneath the one that's going away on the left. So what we're going to want to do is to use the underneath wire first. Now, if you had lain your wire over the top, wrapped them around, we're still going to operate in exactly the same way. You've got a right hand wire and a left hand wire, and one of them will be beneath the other as we're looking at it. So my right hand wire is underneath. So I'm going to just make sure that that base bead is pushed all the way down against the wrapping wire, which is sitting against the coil down at the base. I'm going to pinch that bead into position and take the lower of my two wires, which is the right hand wire, and draw it around and over the top of that core wire. So it's just circling around the outside, going over the top of the core wire, and then I want it to come very, very sharply back underneath. So it's gone over the top, draw that around. We want to ensure that we're not deforming the core wire, and that's why earlier on we gave that a little bit of strengthening. So I'm going to give that a gentle squeeze just to sit that down into position, like so. And we want that to be a nice tight bend that goes around that core wire. I'm then just going to straighten the wire that was on the right, circled around the gemstone, over the top of that core wire and back underneath. Now I've pulled it back over to the right hand side, so we're always going to be returning to where we started. So now the wire which was on the left, which was the upper of the two wires, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I will turn it on its side so it's easier to see. Just a little bit of warming through that first couple of inches of wire to begin with. draw that wire around the outside of your base gemstone. Now that doesn't look very pretty to me, it looks a little bit baggy, so I'm going to retract that for a second and just give that another warm through to make sure that I'm happy with the fluidity of that wire when it goes around the outside of that base gem. So drawing that back over the top, that's a much more fluid line, pushing that over the top of the core wire and then very firmly back and underneath, back exactly where it was a moment ago. So I'm going to squish that down into position, very, very gently drawing a nice, neat loop around the central core wire. And again, I want to pull that back out to the side so that those two wires are exactly where they were. The right-hand wire is still on the right-hand side, having travelled over the top and around. And the left-hand wire is also where it was before, over the top, back and underneath. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to thread on my 7 chakra colour beads onto the core wire in the relevant order. If you've not worked with chakras before, just think of it as a rainbow with the red starting down at the bottom. Now the mnemonic device that I've always used since childhood is Richard of York gave battle in vain. Now the beginning of each of those words, Richard is for red, so it's just a letter mnemonic device. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet. So whatever device you use, maybe you're just one of those clever people who can remember the colour order of the rainbow. All it is the colour order of the rainbow. Now you could use any number of gemstones you wanted for this design to work. They don't have to be chakra colour, but I'm showing them with chakra colours because I think it's a beautiful way to enhance what is essentially a very, very simple coil bead drop pendant. So as you can see, I've added my chakra beads onto the central core of the drop pendant that we're working up today. And to stop those from sliding off the end whilst we're working, I'm just going to warm the last ½ inch or so of the wire and just fold that back around. Now I'm sure we've got plenty of wire to work with to create a fancy bail if we want to. This is just enough to stop things going flying. I can be a bit clumsy and things often get knocked off my desk. So today I'm working with amethyst here down at the bottom, and then my 7 chakra beads are, the red is garnet, the orange is carnelian, the yellow is an agate, the green is, let's have a look at that, that's a green chalcedony, the blue is a dyed agate, then I have got iolite and I've got amethyst up at the top there. So any beads that you want to work with, but I love the order that you get with the chakra designs. So the right hand wire is the one that's currently lowest, and that's what we're going to always do. We're going to go right then left, then right then left. That's how we're going to work this project up. So I'm going to keep the first bead, my lovely red garnet, down at the bottom. I'm going to apply a little bit of warmth to that first section of wire. I'll turn it on its side. So again, I'm going all the way around the right hand side of that bead, and I'm going to push with my nail to draw that back underneath. Now if you scooch those beads out the way, you can see that that's quite an open and loose wrap at the moment. So what we want to do is draw that slightly closer together. Now you'll be at pains to make sure that you don't squash your beautiful gemstone bead, because that would be a disaster. But you can see how this is going to look from really early on in the design, how this is going to build up in that goddess style weave. So what I am going to do is very, very carefully and gently, being respectful of those beads, just squish that wire until I get a nice flattened shape that goes around the core wire. I'm then just going to pull that back out to the right. So I'm going to flip this over on its side again, warm that first section of wire, draw that around over the top of the design, push it down so that it sits above our first wrap with the right hand side, use that central core that we strengthened, sounds like a Pilates class now, just to get a loop around the central core wire. Again, being respectful of our beads, giving that a bit of a squeeze just to get a nice flattened effect going on. So I'm just going to warm and smooth that through on both sides and just speed through these next 7. It really doesn't take long once you get the idea. So pulling that around, and what's happened here is I've pulled that slightly too hard, And you can see that because we're respectful of our wire, I've got an opportunity just to straighten that back up a little bit. Warming that wire over the top, use my nail to guide it, that comes back down underneath. Now you can be quite lazy if you want to be, and squeeze those two into position at the same time. Push the next bead down into position, and once you get the hang of it, once you get the rhythm, it doesn't actually take that long. So we're always going the right hand one first because that was the lowest of the two. Now if that happens and it just gets slightly awry, very, very carefully, avoiding mangling the beads at all costs, they need to be protected. And then what I'm going to do is just push them down on the core so that they sit as neatly as possible. So we're going to continue all the way until we finish those last 4 beads. So I'm just going to warm that wire through first, all the way around, back on itself, over the top, all the way around and back on itself. Now if you don't want to squish any of them and you like that slightly more 3D effect, then you do that, that's entirely up to you. It still creates a really nice pattern to work with. So bringing that blue into play now, push that down and around, and then we're going to do the left hand side of the wire, trying to keep this as straight as possible. Now we're getting up to the section of the core wire that we didn't overly strengthen. So if you want to make your life slightly easier, you can just give that a bit of a nom-nom with those flat pliers. Squash that down, bring the eye light into position, wrap around. If you want to slow it down, just do one side at a time, left hand wire over the top and around. Give that a squeeze. Last bead comes down into play, and it really doesn't take too long. What can happen though is that the design can twist slightly. So you can very, very gently just coerce that to sit as straight as you want it to. So last time the right hand wire comes around, and then the left hand wire comes around. Now as an optional topper to the design, you can add some empty goddess weave or macrame style weaving with the wire. You don't have to, because the pendant is actually quite a long drop already at this stage, but if you want to, all you would do is just repeat that exact same technique, but there's just no bead in the way. Now when I first started discovering this weave, I was making quite baggy and they weren't always even with those wraps. So if you slow that down, you can make that a little bit more even and a little bit more repetitive. I'm just trying to show you the technique today, so what I'm going to do is just draw those slightly closer together, and you can force it to be slightly more even if you want to. So we're just going to do 3 of those empty goddess weaves without beads. So this technique is exactly the same. That's gotten a little bit tense, so I'm going to put just a tiny bit of heat in there, over the top and back around. And then you can take a little bit of time getting those to sit the same distance apart as it moves up the design. So what we would need to do is have a look at how much wire we've got left over and work out what our priorities are. We can continue adding on with those empty goddess wraps so that we run out of the left and right hand wire, and we're left with a single wire at the top to generate a simple wrapped loop up at the top like this one. This one's got a lot of empty goddess weaves and then just a single wrap of wire around at the top there, just to show what that looks like with a single wire. What I am going to show you is if we were to have the wire as it is on the board right now, where there's a little bit of an excess, I'll show you how to make that into a slightly more fancy bail. So we've done our 3 little empty goddess wraps there, which I think is the same. No, I did 4 on this one, it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to show you how to do a slightly fancier weave up on the bail like so. So what we need for this one is a short amount of 0.4mm wire, which I have to hand just here. You don't need vast amounts of it, but what you can achieve with this is just a slightly more decorative bail. So the first thing that we need to do is to align those 3 wires so that they're all coming up in a straight line. So if I pop my 0.4 out of the way, pop the pendant out of the way, what we're going to do is just manipulate these wires until they all sit side by side, coming upwards. So it's just a case of making sure that that's nice and warm before bringing them up side by side at the top of your pendant design. Now you can choose any weave that you like, but I'm going to show you a really pretty little weave which is quite nice when you've got 3 wires to work with. So this at the top can now be trimmed away because otherwise that's going to catch on my fingers. Pop that in the scrap pot. And to make life slightly easier, what I'm going to do is flare out the 2 side wires. Now I'm going to be a bit gentle with them and just open them a little bit up at the top. So you can see we've got about 1.5 inches to work with just to get a nice interesting bail right up at the top. You can of course just go for a naked bail at the top with no wire weaving whatsoever. But what I'm going to do is show you a similar weave to the one that's on the bail here. So we're going to start by casting on, as it were, by wrapping 4 times around that central core. So I started with a small tail so that I can get that all used up. You might prefer to use your pliers to get that into position so that you don't end up with tiny, tiny stab holes in your fingertips. And give that a nice little squeeze just to tighten that up. So I've gone for 4 wraps around that central core. I'm going to slide that right down as far as it will go. This is the front face of our pendant. If you flip it over and have a look at the back, it's still an attractive design. It doesn't matter. It's just going from the front to the back, from the front to the back, whereas our design is looking in this direction, so it doesn't really matter whichever way you want to work it. They both look quite pretty. So pushing that centralised wrap down into the middle like so. What we're going to do next is wrap the centre and the right wire 1 time. And then we're going to come up between the right wire and the central wire. And we're going to encircle the central and the left wire, like so. And then we're going to come up again between the right hand wire and the central wire and wrap 4 times around only the middle. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, that's 4. Push that down every time you get to a section. If you want to do that with pliers, you absolutely can. We're looking to push the coils down. Very, very gently give that a squeeze to set that into position. Can just tighten the whole thing up when it's quite a young segment. Before we now wrap once around the right and central wire, then once around the central and left wire, and then 4 times again around the core wire. You get into quite a nice rhythm with these, and you can use any weave that you want to, but this is one that looks quite nice on a 3 wire bail. So just going to push those down, make sure that they're not loose, and then wrap 4 times around that central wire. Now if you see what I'm doing here, I'm looping the tail of the wire around the central core and pulling it into position. I can only do this because there's a little bit of residual strength in this central core. It's been worked really, really hard. What can go wrong if you get a little bit over enthusiastic is that you wrap the wire around, pull it up into position, and then your central core wire comes forwards. It can be quite difficult to rescue. So you just continue on in the same way until you have filled up this section of your wire with maybe a 1/2 inch or so at the bottom there. So I have a section now which I worked up earlier. It has a slightly different weave on the bail section at the top, in so much as instead of doing a single wrap around the right and central, I've gone for a double. We'll drop you back down to the board and you can take a closer look. So you can see that the idea here is very, very similar. I've used the same 7 chakra beads. In this piece I've got, I believe it to be an amethyst from my stash pot, coiled down at the bottom with those 7 beads on the central core, and then I've gone for 7 empty goddess wraps, and then I've woven up a segment up at the top. So here's the piece we were working a second ago, complete with a dog hair, sorry about that. So all I've done is I've woven and left myself a little bit of spare up at the top, but the design is exactly the same to get to this point. So what we're going to do next is to create a decorative bail up at the top. So to get this slightly flattened and machined look, all I will have done is made sure that all my coils are nice and tight. I finished with 4 wraps around that central core, and then I very, very carefully just pressed down all the way along, In doing so, not only have I set where these weaves sit, or where these wraps sit, I've also added a little extra strength to that central core wire. So what we're going to do now is decide which way is our up. They both look really pretty, but as I'm holding it in this direction, this is my up. What I'm going to do is grip at the point where the goddess weaving stops and the bale weaving starts. I'm going to grip that with any flat pliers and push that forwards at 90 degrees, having decided this is the front. The next thing that we need to do is find a round form to generate a bale shape. I'm going to use my bale makers, and I'm just going to wrap that around until it sits at the back. So I've used all of my woven section to create the bale, and I just need to manipulate that slightly until it sits exactly where I want it to. So with my 2 spare tails of wire, if I flip that over onto the back, I'm just going to open those out to the side. Now you can get a really good sharp bend up there if you use your pliers. I got a little bit overexcited and just didn't wait. So what I'm going to do is take the central core wire and just draw that out of the way for a second. So with the 2 tails, which are the residue of the left and right weaving wires, what I want to do is tie that bale into a permanent position. So I'm going to take the slightly shorter one first, make sure that that bale is in fact closed up comfortably, and I'm going to draw that tail wire all the way around at the top of the goddess weaving section. All I'm doing here is wrapping that around the core of the pendant. So luckily enough for me, that tail is finishing just on the back, so I'm going to just squeeze that until it fits hidden away inside the weave. And then I'll take what was the opposite side, the left hand wire, draw that all the way around, and I'm just going to leave that on the back for a second. I'm going to give that a gentle squeeze like so, and I'm going to have a look at what we've got left over. Now there's a little bit of an end there, so I just want to make sure that that sits inside the pendant so it doesn't scratch on anything. So that's all nicely tucked away. The short wire that I've got, I'm going to turn into a minute coil to sit on the back of the pendant, so my round nose pliers come into action now. Generating that coil, drawing that all the way around, and then I'm just going to push that down on the back of the pendant. That hides any gubbins that I don't particularly want people to see. That spare tail of wire that we had at the back, we can now just bring out to the front, and you can turn that into a coil as well if you want to. It certainly doesn't need to be that long, so I'm going to trim away the excess down to around about 1 inch. Take that tail, pop it in the scrap pot, and then what we're going to do is to generate a coil to sit on the front of the pendant as well. If you run out of wire and you don't have enough for any coils, it doesn't matter, as long as you tuck the tails away really neatly inside the design. Now when I bring this coil down as far as it will go, I'm going to have a look and see whether it's going to look better coming up, like so, or if it might look better going down, and I think today that will look better going down. Now you can be a little bit more neat than I have been today. I'm probably not fighting a virus, so you can take a little bit more time and just get that super neat. So if we pop those side by side with one that I made earlier, there's a couple of options. Here's a piece that's in progress that I'll probably finish up, and then you can see them all side by side at the end. So you don't have to do many of the goddess the goddess weaves by themselves. You don't have to do any if you don't want to. You can have short drops or long drops. You can just have a plain coil at the bottom, or you can have a gemstone. I hope you've enjoyed those today, which is the Goddess Chakra Drop Pendant. Lots of options to make it your own. I'm going to create some kits for the beads, either with or without a gemstone down at the bottom there. I do hope that you have a lovely day no matter what it is you're doing. This video is going out on Halloween, so enjoy yourselves this evening. Have a lovely, lovely week ahead, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Hopefully a little bit less throaty and quiet. Do take care. I'm Gem Hawks. Please do like and subscribe. It helps the channel get seen, and I'll see you very, very soon. I'm going live on Facebook tomorrow, which is the 1st of November. If you fancy hanging out for a bit, it's at 8 PM Greenwich Mean Time. See you soon. Bye for now.